welcome, and I think, well, it looks like people have filtered in, so let's get going. I'm Noah Falstein. I'm a longtime game developer who's spent a lot of work in this area, and I'll be chairing the panel here. But we've got a very distinguished group of people. We've got Corey McCann, CEO of Pear Therapeutics, Stephen Dunne, who is Director of Neuroscience at Starlab and NeuroElectrics, Doug Glen, who, among other things, is chair of Playto Holdings, Isabela Granic, CEO of the Playto Institute and a professor at Radboud University in the Netherlands, and Howard Rose, who's CEO and founder of DeepStream VR. So we've got a great range of experience here, and we're just going to dive in and explore, and feel free to wander a bit, and I will try to save some time for questions for the audience near the end. But let's sort of dive in from here. The first thing that I'm curious about asking is, coming from the games industry, I know that often there are if not clashes, there are awkward fits sometimes between what works really well from the game side of point of view and the necessary therapies. I mean, in the games world, we're used to being able to change the rules of physics, or certainly the geography and everything if we need to. And in the real world, we can't do that as often. I think I'm just curious if people could start by talking about any experiences they've had where there were particular problems trying to work those things together, or conversely, things that were surprisingly easy and profitable and useful. And let's just start down the line and kick it off from there.
Sure, sure. So I guess just to give just a little bit of background, the Pear team is working to combine prescription drugs with digital interventions, many of which are gamified. And because of that, we have a bi-coastal team, one half of which are pharmaceutical experts, and the other half of which are traditional technology and game designers. I think there's a big opportunity in order to enhance human health at the interface of the two, but no one has done this because it's pretty darn difficult. Roughly half of our team is confused in any of our given conversations. And we were just, actually, Noah, you and I were talking through some examples where API in the pharmaceutical world means a very, very different thing from API in the digital health world. And so someone says API, and again, no one knows what we're talking about. It's something that for us, we work on all the time. I think we're getting better. And as I watch the evolution of this conference over the last 3 years, I think you're starting to see the same people fluently speak both healthcare and game design language, but it's not easy.
That's good. Stephen?
Okay, well, again, to kind of give some context of where we are, we've just finished developing the technology, which you can see outside, basically wireless EEG and wireless TDCS or TACS in one package. So we can start to think about some of the things Adam mentioned yesterday, closed loop systems, and then how they would be used in gaming is very interesting. So we haven't actually got to the point of integrating with games. We're not really having these conversations yet, but a few examples, we are doing things like neurofeedback for attention deficit disorder, and we've developed some games in Unity for that. And when we talk to, and it depends on the group you work with, but in some cases they're like, that's far too cool, it's too interesting. You have to make it boring, it has to be work. And it depends on the culture as well, and country by country we see people thinking about this differently. Here, everybody wants it to be as flash as possible, and they assume that this will make it more engaging, which is true, and then people will counter-argue, you don't want it to be engaging, because that's not the point, it's about entrainment, etc. So even in that kind of little contact we've had already, we're kind of seeing that it's not so straightforward. Going forward, though, I think the real value will come when we start to do this closed loop stuff with the types of games that Adam is developing. And hopefully we'll work directly with those guys. We've been talking about it a lot, so I think now is kind of the time for that to happen. But they're driving their games in a very controlled way based on the neuroscience, and that's something we can plug into more easily. So I think it's going to be very interesting.
Great. Doug?
Yeah, hi. So at Playto, we're making clearly consumer-facing products. games that use neurofeedback in order to help kids develop life skills, initially focus. So when you're selling a consumer product, you've got to sell a product that a consumer wants to use. And so it's very clear to us that the success of our product, it would be academic if kids didn't want to play the game because it's fun to play. And when you're in the games business, you get humbled very quickly because you're a bunch of adults who think you're pretty clever, who are judged by a jury of 10 and 12-year-olds who are always right. So first and foremost, we have to satisfy that jury, but then we also have to satisfy the side of the company that has the more rigorous and clinical therapeutic concerns. And you can't compromise. If you compromise, you lose, you die. You've got to optimize both of these simultaneously, and it's a really tough trick. Among other things, you've got a contradiction in business models. On the clinical side of things, your business model is one of rigorously and methodically developing products that work, that have successive proofs, and eventually get to something that's working extremely well that you can bring to market. On the game side, you're in a hits business, and no matter how clever you are, as Noah and I can testify from the years we worked together, sometimes you hit it out of the ballpark and sometimes you don't. And we have to reconcile those two sides of the business. You can see the contradiction even in the name of this conference, neurogaming. You'd really have to struggle to find two disciplines that are more different in their approach to excellence than neuroscience and game design. And thus lies the fascination of what we do.
Yeah, so for us, this is actually at the core of what the Play Nice Institute does. So I'm the founder of the Play Nice Institute on the one hand, which develops games for children's emotional health and well-being, but I'm also a professor at Radboud University in the Netherlands, and my expertise is in developmental psychopathology. So I've been working for a long time, almost 20 years, trying to figure out how to develop programs that help children learn emotional resilience skills so that we also prevent anxiety and depression. And part of what we learned really early on when I started to get interested in using games as intervention tools and promotion tools and prevention tools is that we really needed commercial professional game designers on our team. And if we were going to use games to change behaviors and emotions, we needed these games to be incredibly engaging and beautiful and immersive and emotionally evocative. And so I needed to pull together, we now call it the GEM Consortium, which is Games for Emotional and Mental Health, but the point was to bring together academics and scientists with entrepreneurs, with clinicians, and then with the end users, with adolescents who might be at risk for anxiety and depression, for example, and we sit at the same table. And part of what we did for the first 2 years is try to understand each other's language. When I talk about a mechanism, a psychological mechanism, how do I translate that into a mechanic that changes behavior? And we've spent lots and lots of time iterating over those kinds of questions so that now we have a model of how to develop games, how to evaluate those games, both in terms of user engagement, but really importantly from my science perspective, how do we evaluate real world change, real emotional changes in these children? And then also how to run the randomized controlled trials in an efficient enough way that we aren't way behind the curve as technology changes. So all of those things I think are really important. And to the direct question of what challenges there are in game design, for us, the beauty of game design is that they allow clinicians and teachers to get into the homes and the hands of children in such an effective and immersive way and change behaviors in ways that we had never thought would be possible.
Very good. So my name's Howard Rose. I'm the CEO of DeepStream VR, and we develop virtual reality applications to help relieve pain. And I've been in the VR industry for about 20 years. developing different applications for PTSD and exposure therapy and different kinds of things, and done projects funded by NIH. And I think there's a few components to this that might be of interest. One is, I've really felt acutely this clash of cultures between Silicon Valley, which values disruption, and medicine, which values tradition. And the NIH has always played this role of using grant funding to inspire, to develop basic scientific research that is going to spawn into, translate into medical advancement that will hopefully improve people's lives. Their current funding situation means that there's a hole there. And I think that we've received grant funding to do virtual reality applications and explore that as a way of treating mental health and lifestyle, changing lifestyles and pain research. But when you look at the sort of task before us is how we do this translation from research to practice. And we're working with, as game designers and technologists are feeling, we come from a world of, wow, there's, disruption means that there's this potential, there's an opportunity, there's, a market, there's all of those positive things, but medicine doesn't really want to be disrupted. And, I think the values, the positive value that the sort of technologists bring is that, it's this iterative process. So we build something, we get it out there, we test it, which is very different from the medical model of randomized controlled trial, the gold standard. So there's lots of different ways that these two clashes manifest themselves. And we've experienced that personally. But the exciting part is that I think that there are enough early adopters who are impatient with the way that, the standard of doing business is just not good enough. We have a lot of people suffering, a lot of people underserved. So I think that we can bring that to bear.
Okay. Well, interesting themes I'm hearing, running through this. That one of the things that comes up with NIH and with other government-funded research is, well, there's the issue of the government itself, and I think it might be interesting to talk about a little bit about different countries, because I've seen in this area the U.S. has done a fair amount, but there are other countries in Europe and Asia in particular that are putting lots more, certainly per capita, putting a lot more investment into exploring things. And some places where, the ready financing from Silicon Valley, it's always, the grass is always greener, where everybody outside of the U.S. thinks that this is the easy place to get money, and we think it's easier to get money from their governments and everything. But can people talk about this issue of interplay of different countries and cultures that came up, and also the governmental influences? Any stories of people who've had particular successes or difficulties in making things work and pleasing some of these governmental funders, for example? Anybody want to take that?
We started in Europe, and now we're kind of in the process of moving across to the US, Boston, for the moment. Mm-hmm. So everything we developed was originally developed in Europe with European funding, quite a lot of it. And the expectation is that you kind of keep it in Europe and you create jobs in Europe. But as you go, you realize that it's just not possible to do medical device development in Europe, where every single country is a different scenario. And you have to have a strategy for every single one, mm-hmm. and they all have their own complications, versus one big one in the US, with a much larger market. So the temptation is always there to go across the Atlantic, and that's where you make your big push. And it's exactly what we're doing right now. So we opened in Boston. Development will stay in Europe, but our next move is to see what happens in the US. So FDA is high on our list, even though we know it's quite more complicated than the equivalent in Europe. We already have a clinical device for Europe, but the reimbursement scheme in every country is different. The health service in every country is different, so that it's actually simpler to start with the FDA.
Right. So it's a practical,
from our perspective,
practical business considerations, as much as the research side. And Isabela, I know the Netherlands has been in the forefront of a lot of this stuff, and there's quite a bit of interesting work going on there. Is there similar things you've seen of the European-American gap?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to take advantage of, both of these contexts because I have a lot of colleagues in the States, and so we can apply for things like SBIR grants through NIH and other. And then the Netherlands has this incredibly rich game design community, and the government has done quite a bit in trying to infuse that commercial area with money and innovation funds and seed funds. So as a result, they see, and the EU as well, there are these Horizon 2020 grant opportunities where technology and social innovation are really being rewarded, or at least they're looking for those kinds of multidisciplinary programs. So that's really where we're targeting at least the scientific funding. Our problem is development money, right? So that's where we come to investors in Silicon Valley, because I can get money from these granting agencies to do my research and my randomized controlled trials, but to develop those really high-end games that can compete with AAA kinds of games, we need development money, and that's the hard part, I think, for us.
Yeah, well, one of the issues is that, particularly for those of us who are consumer-facing companies, we're looking for investment and grants, to the extent we're looking for grants, for a category that doesn't exist yet. For the use of games to improve life skills and lifestyles. Not edutainment, but actually improving the way that we go about coping with life. So in the US, we can go to Silicon Valley and look for funds for innovative companies that are carving out important new markets. It's appealing there. In Hong Kong, Playto has gotten funding as an innovative entrepreneurial company in the play space. But there may be other markets where the right strategy would be to sell the science. And so I think it's going to be specific to the willingness of a government to make investments in categories it's already defined, and the willingness of angel investors and VCs to fund a potentially huge new market, but one that's very much in its infancy.
I think underlying this is the difference between a socialized medicine system and what we have in the United States, which is a very fractured. We don't have a medical system. There is no national insurance. There is no national standards for hospitals. Everything is, there are so many individual players. The insurance companies play different roles. The pharmaceutical companies play different roles. So if we do a lot of work with collaborators in Canada, and in their system, you can, the bar is pretty high to get in, but once you're in, you can get all over the country. And so the United States is a great place and has traditionally been a great place for innovation. And the sort of fractured nature of the market and the nature of healthcare delivery enables entrepreneurs to have those inroads. You can find early adopters in our system, which you can't find in a socialized medicine system. So I think in terms of early adoption, I mean, it's interesting what you say to come back to the United States, because I think a lot of American companies look at innovating here, getting your feet settled and your foundation, and then taking it abroad, and then a lot of the innovation comes back to the United States. So I think it's important to just recognize the difference between those two kinds of systems, and that's what we're working in.
I think just building on Howard's comments, certainly we do see some of these European medical systems where there's a greater focus on prevention. We see a great deal of willingness to pay for digital therapies there, certainly much more so than in the US. But make no mistake, the big market is here. I think from the Pear perspective, we've had very good experiences both with granting agencies. So we're doing a project with NASA as part of their Mission to Mars program, and also in raising risk capital. We have a number of our investors here today. But I think playing back to this idea of different philosophies and different camps, we even see very, very different opinions and takes on this space across the US. So, we're out speaking with the healthcare investors. who are very, very interested in regulation, understands the value of placing barriers to entry via regulation, and even the legalized monopoly that comes with a pharmaceutical label and certain types of exclusivity associated with the pharmaceutical label. And then we're also speaking with groups on the tech side, many of whom are here in the Valley, who frankly have sort of an F the FDA mentality, where one should roll these things out in large populations, optimize them over time, sell them directly to patients, and sell them directly to payers. So I think this is still a place where there's no right answer for us, but we do try to bring these two camps together.
Well, that theme, I mean, a lot of you have touched on this now. One of the things that comes up is a question of money, obviously, but it's complicated because sometimes you're doing research that's funded by a government agency, but you're trying to make a commercial product. Sometimes you're trying to make something for an insurance company. Sometimes it's direct to the consumer. I'm just curious if there are any thoughts anybody wants to share about that relationship or the difficulty sometimes between your ultimate customer and your whoever it is that's footing the bills, and usually, I found that there often are 3 or 4 different, individuals or masters you have to please in order to make it all work. Does that ring a bell for anyone? You want to talk about problems you've had trying to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's actually less of a problem, and we look at it more as an opportunity because in psychology and in trying to prevent mental health problems to begin with, we usually have a real problem with scaling up, and that's one of the biggest barriers, and cost is another one. Adherence to treatment protocols or prevention protocols is another really big one. And so the way that we've tried to pitch to government agencies is that not only can we create a product that we can run our randomized controlled trial and tell you that it's as good as or better than the conventional programs out there, but we can also say that if we commercialize it, our reach is absolutely exponential compared to what, me getting my cognitive behavioral programs into schools. And so I have 600 kids, 800 kids being exposed to my program versus commercializing a product and having that potentially in the hands of millions internationally is a huge one, and the granting agencies buy it. And at least for us, we've been successful in trying to get that message across, and it's compelling.
Mm-hmm. To go back to you mentioned Horizon 2020 in Europe earlier. That's their whole goal. They want you to commercialize to the point where you're writing proposals with clinical trials, and they want to see the business plan as well. Like, it's a bit early, but okay. But they really want to see commercialization. It's the whole philosophy of the European funding system now. And people are complaining because it's actually gone maybe a bit too far for some of the basic science. And it can be difficult to balance it, but it's good. It's, for a company like us, it's perfect. They consider us a success case. For European funding, they gave us early money, and then they saw that we created a spin-off and went with that. And for them, it's the perfect scenario.
For anyone who sat through the funding panel yesterday, you saw the two ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, it's recognized that this category, broadly defined, is a great investment because the potential of this area to build a huge category on the consumer side and on the clinical side, it's massive. A transformational opportunity to, on one hand, replace pharma, on the other, a mass market way of helping kids develop life skills in a better way. And if we were to look for an analog to this conference, it might be the West Coast computer fairs of 30 years ago. It's obvious it's going to be a big thing. It's just not clear, what path it's going to take. But then offsetting it, since you have no normative data, you've got no market to speak of, it's difficult for investors to figure out the logic of where to invest, how to read forecasts, how to understand what the valuation of a company is in a market that doesn't have peers. So for adventurous investors, this is really, really exciting. And for so many of the investors who like to follow trends, it's a scary place to invest.
I think directly speaking to this disconnect between academic and government groups and industry and regulators, we've gone out and in-licensed a lot of our pieces of content from academia. The data is great, and our lead program in addiction was funded with about $25 million of NIH funding. The data is great, and certainly for many of the grants that were written and received for that program, there was some sort of a commercialization portion that was at the end of the grant. That said, what we see across the board is that the data that's collected for these interventions is not necessarily applicable toward approval or a label in many cases, and the content that has been created is oftentimes not created using good manufacturing procedures, and hence sort of put it in the queue for a 510K. So I think non-dilutive groups and government agencies know what they want. I think academics do a great job of sort of writing to that spec, but there still is a big disconnect in terms of how this actually gets to patients.
Great.
Maybe to take this, I like all of these points, and maybe to take it in a little bit of a different direction. I think so in our work with pain, using VR as a form of pain relief, we've been doing this research for 10 years, funded by NIH, et cetera. We have a lot of robust data about the result. And I think that in talking to doctors and figuring out how we roll this out and thinking about really what we're doing, you know, I think of this as we're not just doing business as usual. It's a very different kind of activity. So VR is an engaging experience. It's a very active way to get people involved in their own treatment or in their own quest for wellness. And I think that that's the essence of kind of what is different about digital health, is that it's not a business as usual. And we talk about it, I think about it as we're changing people from health consumers into health producers. And the standard experience and the way that we think about healthcare is that I'm going to go to the doctor, and the doctor is going to administer some sort of treatment, and I'm going to get better. Digital health is really a very different model. And we're trying to enable, in many different ways, ourselves and other people are trying to enable, give the tools to the patient to maximize their own internal capacity to be healthy on their own. So this is changing the relationship of the patient to the doctor. So the doctor is no longer the sole source of information. They have to adopt new approaches. Young doctors are much more in tune with this than older doctors. But I think that it's interesting to think about how that affects things like, that affects adoption, but also affects how you analyze. You know, the gold standard is a randomized controlled trial, but if each individual is using it on their own in a different way, do we have a like group? Does it fit all the traditional characteristics of a research project, or a research study? So I think that there's benefits to this, because we can, with digital health, we can broaden the sense of people's lives. So when you go to a doctor and you have chronic pain or you have pain, you say, "Doc, I hurt." He says, "Don't do that." And then he pokes you and gives you a prescription and says, "Come back in 6 weeks." But we don't take into account, is that person socially engaged? Are they depressed? Are they active? The factors in their lives are, you know, it's a pretty limited set that are taken into account. So I think that we have the chance to broaden that and make it a lot more robust and get better results from it, and also take into account a lot of factors that, you know, medicine is actually just missing.
Well, you know, let me build on some of what you said there, and also, you know, Doug made the point that the gaming world and the medical world have been fairly far apart in a lot of ways. One of the ways, though, that I found that we communicate quite well is that they're both industries that are extremely aware of new technological developments and often have, and certainly this conference and the expo floor out there, just full of gadgets that I think it's amusing for me to see how it appeals to both the medical people and the game people, but sometimes in very different ways. And one of the kind of happy coincidences, I think, of neuroscience and games taking off has also been this addition of VR, which, as Howard well knows, has been around for a long time. And I remember seeing Jaron Lanier showed us something back at Lucasfilm in 1984 when he was first playing around with the idea of the glove and a visual programming language. And it's taken a long time for that to take off, but we've got VR right now. We've got so many other technologies. You're reminding me also, Howard, of the presence of the internet making it possible to reach everybody at once and not have that traditional, you go to the doctor one-on-one, but it scales so tremendously. And of course, games, one of the other reasons that they're interesting is that you can put something out there that thousands or millions of people can use instead of having to train individuals to go out and one-on-one or even one-on-20 go talk to groups. So just in general, I'm curious about new technologies, whether it's VR, whether it's use of big data, whether it's head-mounted transcranial stimulation, all sorts of exciting stuff that we're seeing. Where do people see promise? Where do people see concerns that it's not quite ready for prime time?
Well, I think one of the things, this is just picking up on what you were talking about, and this, because of the internet and e-health and e-mental health kinds of initiatives, I think one of the things that is not usually thought about so much when we think about games is that they have this ability to collect data and real-time data about how people are interacting with these systems and what kind of feedback these systems are giving back and how they respond in turn. And so a back-end sort of system that you can build where we can collect the data and as basically an assessment tool, we can figure out how people are playing at the beginning and in a stealth sort of way, instead of getting these self-reports, certainly in psychology, this is a real problem. Instead of asking, how sad are you, what do you avoid, etc., you create and you design these rich emotional environments and then allow the player to play in that context naturally, and through that build a back end that assesses people. Okay, this person seems to have, liabilities or limitations in this area, they're strong in there, and then iterate in the next sort of level of the game, challenge that person on precisely the limitations they have, but also then collect the data and be able to assess outcomes right away and to assess the processes of change and the mediators of change and how then we can use that data to improve our games and to strengthen them, but also personalize them so that they are maximally useful to whoever's actually starting off. And then thinking about creating a sort of database or repository of these games and other e-health kinds of interventions where the clients or players or whatever you want to call them can also give feedback about how they feel they've improved. It's not only empowering, but it creates for researchers an ability to survey the kinds of interventions that are out there and figure out how, the clusters of groups of clients or patients that are benefiting most from this particular game or this particular neurofeedback headset and so on. And I think there's such potential in that connectivity that I think we should do something about.
This conference is an extreme example of innovator's dilemma, right? Precisely because the technology is not just so new, but so different from anything that large markets have seen. If this were a conference of people who'd just invented the cell phone, we say, okay, we understand how to market that. People make phone calls now, they got wires stuck to it, and we'll give them a way to untether. Or if we invented better batteries, okay, people know how to use batteries, now they can use them longer. But the idea of being able to adopt products that work because they're measuring your neural activity is so new that as entrepreneurial companies here, we're not just selling a product or even a brand. We've got to be the missionaries for a category. So I think it's more a question of the challenge of the extreme newness of what we're doing than the technical details of what makes it new.
I think just building on that concept, I mean, it's really a playground out there in the expo. You know, there's so much cool technology, from games to VR to AR, and certainly that will all impact the standard of care for mental health. I think for me, you know, what is the technology that has the opportunity to be the penicillin of neuropsychiatry? And that's the smartphone. You know, we now carry around these supercomputers which have the ability to track our location, to monitor our interaction with others, and to display these cognitive experiences that are game changers, no pun intended, but that have the ability to be very therapeutic for patients, and everyone has one of these. So if I sort of think about the hierarchy of opportunity, that sits absolutely at the top from my perspective. You know, I know that this is the NeuroGaming conference, and certainly gaming does present a really interesting opportunity here. But from a very reductionistic perspective, the game is all about dose. So this is about taking a therapeutic paradigm that we know works and about making it sufficiently fun so that people are at a high enough dose so that there's an impact. And I think when you think about that paradigm, it becomes very clear that the game won't be the answer for everyone. So if we sort of liken this to athletics, you have the ungamified exercise on one hand, which is running, and you have the gamified exercise on the other hand, which is tennis. And you have people that tend to like one or both or either or. And while running is arguably not gamified at all, there are still people that love it, do it every day, and come back to it for their release. And so I think we'll see the same thing across these different digital therapies that do the exact same things. For some people, games will be the answer. They'll love them. For other people, games will absolutely not be the answer, and it's going to be something which is more drill-oriented and feel much more like prosaic content.
I think another thing to kind of keep in mind, and people always think this, that you know we're kind of seeing something, you know, at the beginning of something big. This is, you know, again, everything is changing right now, and people always have this feeling. But I think right now, everything has changed. The combination of the different technologies that we can, for the first time, actually think about doing real closed-loop systems, where you have feedback from the game itself about performance, about outcomes. We can measure the activity in real time of what's happening in the brain. Adding the TCS to that, we can then modulate that, or we can basically enhance the effect, depending on which way you use it. So those things literally were not available until this year, those components that you could use them together. And I think another interesting thing from our point of view, whenever we explain what we do, people go, that's fantastic, can you get rid of the cap? You know, because they don't want to wear anything. Now, for the first time, because of headsets, we have a natural platform to put the electrodes back in for free. And nobody's thinking about it because they're happy to wear the HMD in whatever form it is. For us, there's a huge opportunity to have the electrodes there. They're completely transparent. Nobody's even thinking about that aspect, but it's there all the time. So I think those things kind of coming together right now is actually just the start of something huge.
So I think if they're having trouble with the cap, you should show them that sequence from The Matrix where they're sticking that spike into the back of people's heads and say, hey, be thankful that we're not at that point yet.
We've thought about that as well. I don't know if you've seen our dry electrodes. They're like those little pins. If you want really good contact, you just tap them in.
And Howard, I have to hear something about you from VR.
Well, that's the it could be worse sales pitch. I think, you know, I think that there's a few points here. One is that one of the biggest changes is a social change. And this is sort of the first generation of, or maybe we're a little past that, of parents and kids who've grown up playing games. And this is something that has not been the case for the last, you know, in the previous generation. So in watching VR evolve and change over 20 years, you know, VR is sort of the ultimate invasive, you know, you put this thing on and you go to this place and you know you're doing it. The interesting thing about cell phones is that you know, the phone is the motivator to get it. I mean, a lot of people want to run apps on their smartphone, but it does have a function in their lives. And I think that as long as the technology is, sort of the obvious. I don't think that people adopt technologies because, oh my God, I really need an EEG. They're like, I have a real need. I'm in pain, and this is going to help me. And I think that if that's sort of, we're building a platform. We're building a neuro platform to do detection and modulation, and building AI that actually meets the needs of patients in pain, and trying to maximize that. And so we're big believers in biosensors and wearable technology and all of that. But I think, I guess what springs to mind is sort of the epitome of terrible technologies is Bob the Paperclip. And that was like, hi, I know exactly what you want to do, and here I am, and I'm going to annoy you. And if it's interruptive, if it's not, when the standard is it has to really know me and really act and be, intuitive and do that well, if we have a lot of Bob the Paperclip kind of activity, manifestations of this technology, it's not going to get adopted. So I think that it's incumbent on us as we build the technology. Maybe our approach is that we dynamically modulate the games in the background. So we use overt information about your bio state so that you can do typical sort of biofeedback kinds of activities, but also we modulate the game and we try to maximize it and we see what the benefits are. So we try not to, disturb them. But I think that, who would want their car to be all of a sudden saying, oh, you look sad, maybe you should go slower. I think it's going to be interesting how this gets rolled out.
I think there's, it's an interesting thing to explore there. I noticed your heart rate's a little low, so I thought I'd swerve a little bit there just to make things exciting for you. And I have to say, Corey, it's an interesting point in that we're focusing on all these sort of sexy brand new technologies that in some case have an installed base of 0. And phones, with a billion, more than a billion out there and another billion going into people's hands the next few years, if we really want to reach everyone, and not because they're buying it as a medical device, but once they've got it for their other reasons, it just suddenly becomes possible. I think that's a great point. Well, I said I would leave some time. I see we're getting down towards the end, so if it looks like there are quite a few questions, if we could get some microphones out to the people with their hands up.
So this might be a little strange question, but I was wondering, so there's going to be therapeutic experiences delivered through virtual reality and mobile devices and all that. At what point could you see maybe some sort of like a man-in-the-middle attack or some sort of way that that therapeutic experience becomes compromised by an attacker of sorts, and how would the user recognize that?
That is an interesting question. So certainly it's theoretically possible. I think this is the sort of thing that the FDA thinks about a lot. I'm sure that everyone in the room, or most of the people in the room, are familiar with HIPAA. There's the next layer of security of architecture, which is required to get to 510(k) medical device approval. And that's focused on exactly the kinds of esoteric scenarios that you just floated. How can you make sure that your software doesn't push to the wrong window and cause epilepsy or some sort of suicidal ideation, as opposed to a therapy? I think security certainly has to be tight for these things. And I guess without directly answering the question, the FDA shares your concern.
Any other comments on that? It's a touchy one, but thank you for delving into that. Next.
It works. I heard from your end, the industry, the hurdles of investment. Can each one of you talk about from the end user experience, how they feel or how they perceive this kind of disruptive technology instead of the doctor, as you mentioned, how they perceive, for example, now the children, the parents in the example of the children, or the different patients, how they see this technology is very, very important to understand their perception.
I would say that people are hungry for a change. I think that, you know, one of our focuses is to help women through labor and delivery. And I personally have a few friends who are pregnant and looking at that, and I would characterize their attitude as one of excitement and fear. And they have a fear of losing control of the procedure and the medicalization of labor and birth. And I think that that sort of is a great indicator that we need to be doing something better, and they want everything in their corner when they go into that situation. So I think that that's, you know, that holds true for people who are facing a lot of procedures. And I would say that people are hungry for a big change.
Yeah, and from our perspective, it's been overwhelmingly positive. So, you know, we use a neurofeedback headset to, you know, as the controller basically in a game, and these kids, first of all, love. It's just a sexy idea, and they love the idea that they are changing something out there. And in our conventional programs, when we try to teach kids that they have the mental capacity to change their minds and their thoughts, and that will in turn have an impact on their emotions and their coping in their everyday lives, and also the way that everybody else around them will react to them, they don't believe us. But then they have this amazing experience which is, you know, bridged by this headset where they change their mind states and something out there changes. And I think it's an incredibly powerful aha experience that they have, and I think that that's part of the action mechanism that actually helps them generalize into their everyday lives. And for the parents, they're loving it because they know their kids are gaming all the time anyway, and right now they have this context in which they can see their kids incredibly engaged in something that they would otherwise be feeling stigmatized, unmotivated, bored, and trudging to in terms of some kind of a treatment for anxiety, for example. So it's been overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah, talking from a consumer market perspective, you know, neurofeedback headsets have been around for more than 5 years now, and the penetration is so close to zero, you could almost call it that. And it's because, you know, people are not as consumers, are not adopting neurofeedback. What they are adopting, things that are interesting or useful for them that happen to use neurofeedback as a component. So we have done consumer trials with families and kids, and there's a different perspective from, you know, each component of our audience. From a kid's point of view, as Isabela said, they find it extraordinarily cool that they can now see that their mind is doing something. We've had a number of kids say, wow, I never knew what focus was before until I actually saw it. The fact that it was delivered through a neurofeedback headset was less important than the result that they now could visualize their focus, and that meant something important to them. From a parent's point of view, it also didn't matter that neurofeedback was a technology that enabled their kids to grapple with a problem that had been difficult to grapple with. They're just glad that somebody had packaged it into a solution. And likewise, from educators' point of view or clinicians' point of view, each is going to have a different perspective. But I believe that neurofeedback is not what's being adopted. It is just part of a solution that does wondrous things.
And it's part of a solution that's based on technology, which in a lot of cultures is very important, where they worry about over-medication. So we always get this as well, that the parents are really, really interested in exploring something that doesn't depend so much on the pharmacological solution. We kind of deal with different groups. One group would be, say, neurofeedback for attention deficit disorder, and they're the kind of kids that are really into the idea of the technology. And for them, I think the fact that it's neurofeedback is cool. It adds to it. There's other groups of patients we work with where we're seeing them because something very, very bad has happened, and they're kind of, this is their last hope. You know, traumatic brain injury, post-stroke, rehab after they've been told there's no more that you can do physically. So it's kind of a different attitude. They're willing to try anything. So they're not that analytical about where it's coming from at that point. So we kind of see two different ends of the spectrum. because we're doing stimulation as well, we kind of have a wider view of that, I think.
It might not be the most popular sentiment at this particular conference, but I'm of the mind that novel technology is not cool for all that long. So the novelty wears off pretty quickly. I think whether you have a consumer or whether you have a patient, people want one of two things. They either want to be better or they want to be the same and do less work. And so, you know, what we see on the clinical side with our schizophrenia program, schizophrenic patients are coming back to the digital interventions 6, 7, and 8 times per day because it makes them better than medication alone. For the addiction program, people are coming back to their therapeutic software, A, because it makes them better, but B, because they have to do less. So by virtue of bringing the therapy to the patient as opposed to bringing the patient to the therapy, you simplify their lives and you make them remarkably better.
There's probably also the doing it for less money aspect of that too. Okay, who else? Lots of questions. We can pass the mics.
All right. Kind of as we continue down this path, developing new technologies, augmenting reality, and is there going to be a point where maybe we've gone a little bit too far, where we've taken too much control over, you know, how people are taking their health or their lives, or, you know, how do we know where we go and we've kind of taken us out of you know, the experiences that we really want to be in and into a different kind of level? Does that make sense?
Thoughts about limits?
Sounds more like an existential worry, though, rather than
it's a tough one
specific.
to.
I guess.
Yeah.
If we push them to that point, will they know that they're there?
You're serious, though. I mean, that's really a tough thing to know.
And will we be able to bring them back? Sort of related to that, I just want to throw in a personal anecdote. So I have a son. He's in his 20s, and he says something interesting to me. He said, you know, a lot of people criticize my generation because we can't, you know, we multitask, and we're doing so many different things. And we're not like, you know, people say, oh, they're not like me when I was that age. And his attitude, he says, yeah, but we didn't invent this technology. You guys made it, and you gave it to us, and now this is what happens. And so I think that that's an important thing to think about as we roll this out, that we're not just rolling out a technology. I mean, if we're successful. If we're not successful, forget it. But if we're successful, then we really can change the way the business is done, and we change you know, we give people these new and fantastic new tools. It is important to think about the kinds of people that we're generating. And for me, I want to give technologies that are going to make people more independent, that they're in more control. I don't want to take control out of their hands. I want to give them control. I want to give them awareness. And I think if we move ahead with those values, we're not going to go down that sort of dystopian pathway.
Yeah, and just quickly building on that, you know, for us, what we want to do also is create experiences, interactive experiences that actually build bonds and emotional bonds across people and give opportunities to socialize face-to-face. And technology can do that in really small ways that we might not otherwise be able to do, and make us feel more connected and more supported, and find our people across countries and continents in ways that we never have before. And that doesn't have to feel like you are constantly on your phone. You know, there are ways to disrupt that as well, and I think a lot of people are thinking about that.
I thought we got a lot of optimism out of many of the panels when they were contrasting the blunt instrument quality of pharma versus the fine-tuning and the sensitivity and the personalization that's possible with this technology.
I think as well that you and Howard touched on it, you talked about the values you guys have when you're developing your own products. I think we should not forget that it's kind of up to us at the start to decide what our values are and not rely on regulation, not rely on government to make sure we're not allowed to do it later on. If we have this in mind now while we're developing it, particularly for us because we're talking about stimulating the brain, and people are already going, I want to use that for cognitive enhancement for healthy people. So we had to make the decision that we're not going to do that until we know better what it's about, and maybe we will eventually, because adults can make their own decisions about what they want to do. But we have to be sure we understand what the potential implications over time are and all of that, and we just don't know yet. So we had to decide that, and it's not regulated at all right now. I think it's very important for everybody to remember that the responsibility at the very start is up to them. Nobody else is going to, for something new, nobody's going to enforce you.
Well, on that optimistic note, we're unfortunately out of time. I know there are a lot of other questions, but if you will grab the people you want to talk to out in the forum there, appreciate it, and thank you all very much.